What's up, guys? First, subscribe to my YouTube channel, hit the like button, and don't forget to press the bell icon so you get all my new videos.
What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Glove Zone Boxing channel, and today we got a real special one for you. We're joined as always by Nathan, and today we have a very exciting guest sports chat with Matt, aka Matt himself, who's been creating content for a while now, covering college basketball and more recently diving deep into combat sports and especially the rise of Jake Paul and all the madness that comes with it. And right off the bat, Matt makes it clear he's been watching us for a while and appreciates that we don't just blindly support Jake Paul, but we also keep it real and hold him accountable when we feel it's necessary. And that kind of balance is something he says drew him into listening more, so huge shout out for that. And as we get into Matt's own journey in content creation, he shares that his podcast started around 2 years ago, and that while college hoops is his bread and butter, he couldn't ignore the gravitational pull of Jake Paul's bizarre but fascinating transformation from controversial YouTuber to legitimate name in boxing. And what's interesting is Matt admits he didn't like Jake at first. In fact, he straight up says he couldn't stand the guy, thought he was cringy and arrogant and all that, but he also found himself watching the content despite those feelings, which is always funny, right? Because that hate watch energy can be powerful. And then came the Nate Robinson fight, and that's where it clicked for him, not because he was rooting for Jake, far from it, he was rooting hard for Nate. But the idea of this wild card YouTuber going up against a freak athlete like Robinson, who despite being new to boxing was known for his explosiveness and toughness, it just made for compelling viewing. And then boom, Jake flattened Nate in a way nobody expected, and suddenly the world was like, oh okay, this dude might actually be taking this thing seriously. And from there it was one step after another as Jake kept leveling up his opposition, from Ben Askren to Tyron Woodley to Anderson Silva, and of course the Tommy Fury fight. And we get into a really interesting conversation about how every time Jake steps into the ring there's this narrative that gets built up around why he might lose, and then after the fact people go, oh that was easy, he should have won like that all along. But that's not how it felt going in. Like with Nate Robinson, there was legitimate fear that Jake might get wrecked with Ben Askren. You had the Olympian wrestler angle plus that whole real fighter label, and with Tyron Woodley there was real concern about knockout power and veteran savvy, and even Anderson Silva was coming off beating Chavez Jr. in a boxing ring and looking slick as hell, but Jake kept getting it done, and every time he did the goalposts would move. And Matt points out that hindsight is 20/20ths, but in the moment there was always a real possibility that Jake would take an L. And so we fast forward to today, and here we are, Jake Paul versus Mike Perry going down July 20th, and Matt says without hesitation this is Jake's toughest test since Tommy Fury. And that's a sentiment we echo, because Perry is a different breed. He's not just a brawler, he's a psychopath in the best way possible, a dog in the fight who lives for chaos and violence. And it's a brilliant fight from a matchmaking perspective, because Perry doesn't get tired, doesn't back down, and he can absolutely crack. And Matt even goes so far as to say he prefers this matchup to the Mike Tyson one, because Perry is an active fighter in his prime, and this fight fits perfectly with where Jake is in his career right now. And what's interesting is Matt is even considering going down to Tampa to see it live. And you know, if it's anything like Jake's last Tampa appearance where he delivered that iconic KO against Woodley, then hey, maybe lightning strikes twice. And speaking of evolution, Matt dives into his own change of heart over Jake Paul, how he went from seeing him as a cringy internet villain to someone who's earned his respect through hard work, growth, and a clear desire to elevate the sport. And Matt makes a great point about first impressions being powerful and hard to shake, and how a lot of Jake's detractors are just stuck on that early version of Jake from the Disney days or his wild vlogs, and they haven't taken the time to actually follow his progress, see his interviews, understand his goals and the way he's genuinely matured and evolved. And Matt mentions that quote from Jake about how his biggest haters are often his biggest secret fans, and he admits there's some truth to that, because he was watching everything even while disliking him. But over time you can't deny the dedication, and when Jake started helping other fighters like Amanda Serrano, giving them a platform, making moves that benefited others, it started to shift perceptions. And Matt now sees Jake as someone who says things that resonate especially with young men about self-belief, discipline, work ethic, and taking risks. And so much of the hate Jake still gets just comes from people not wanting to let go of that initial opinion. And when people see a trailer For a Tyson fight or a clip from a press conference, they immediately revert to their original bias without acknowledging the years of training growth and accomplishments that Jake's stacked since then, and we get into the whole narrative around Mike Perry being too small, which Matt immediately shuts down, pointing out that Perry might be 5'10", but he's thick strong, has fought at 185, and has a freakishly large head, which is true if you've seen him square up to Logan Paul. The guy is not small by any definition, and then we touch on the fight itself and what kind of strategy Jake needs to employ to win, and Matt emphasizes that Jake cannot fight Perry on the inside, cannot get into a brawl because that's Perry's world. Instead, he needs to use his length, stay on the outside, and box him smartly, and if he does that, Matt sees either a late stoppage or a clear decision win for Jake, and we talk about how Jake's new team led by Theo Chambers brings that Kronk gym style, that aggressive pressure forward approach, and how that might not be the best fit for this particular fight because, again, that plays into Perry's game, and Nathan jumps in to say that he personally preferred the Danny Smith era and especially the performance against Silver, where Jake looked polished, technical, and far more calculated, and with this new team, we haven't really seen Jake go deep into rounds since switching up his corner because his last 3 fights were all short, quick finishes or against lesser opponents, so it's hard to gauge exactly what that evolution looks like in the ring, and that brings up a key point about this Perry fight being not just a physical test, but a mental one, because Jake is going to have to stay disciplined for potentially 8 hard rounds against a guy who wants to drown him in violence. And then we get into something really important, which is Jake's weight cut, because he was bulking up to around 230 to 240 pounds in preparation for Mike Tyson, and now he's got to get down to cruiserweight territory, likely around 199 or 200, which is a massive cut in a short time, and the question becomes, how does that affect his stamina, his speed, his power, and even more so his ability to take a shot, because drastic weight cuts often compromise durability, and if Jake goes in underfueled or flat-footed, Mike Perry will absolutely take advantage of that, and that's where preparation, discipline, and corner advice will play a huge role. And we talk about how Jake's team needs to be ready with the right plan, but Jake also needs to execute and not let emotion take over, because Perry is going to try and drag him into a war, and if he obliges, that could go really badly. And we kind of wrap around the idea that this fight will show us who Jake Paul really is as a boxer, not just as a celebrity stepping into the ring, but as a fighter who's now 7 years into this journey and taking on real threats. And the truth is, Perry has fought killers in MMA and now bare knuckle, and he doesn't shy away from damage. He welcomes it, so Jake needs to be perfect with his timing, footwork, and shot selection, and if he can do that, then win or lose, he'll have earned a massive amount of respect. And finally, Matt sums it all up beautifully by saying, look, this is the kind of fight that gets you excited, not because of the name value alone, but because of the questions it raises about skill, heart, and preparation, and those are the fights that matter, and those are the fights that make you sit up and watch. So July 20th is going to be special, and whether you love Jake Paul or hate him, you're going to tune in, because at the end of the day, he's made himself unavoidable, and every time he steps into the ring, it's a moment, and this one might just be the biggest moment yet. Certainly, here's a rewritten and expanded version of the transcript you provided, rephrased and elaborated to reach a length of approximately 9,000 words in one continuous block of text with no slashes or line breaks. It covers all the key points, while expanding on the ideas, context, and background. The upcoming bout between Jake Paul and Mike Perry has stirred a lot of discussion in the boxing and combat sports community, and understandably so. There's a lot of nuance to consider when analyzing this matchup, from various angles: training history, stylistic differences, past performances, and future implications, and all of these elements blend together to form a highly intriguing storyline for fans and analysts alike. When it comes to Jake Paul's perspective, it's clear that his team expects the fight to last anywhere from 1 to 3 rounds ideally. That would certainly be the plan for Jake, because early dominance and a potential quick stoppage always favors the more technical boxer, especially one whose style relies on picking shots and controlling pace from the outside. But the reality of this fight is that Mike Perry is not just another opponent. He's durable, relentless, and a brawler who thrives in chaos. If this fight extends beyond round 3 and reaches rounds 4 or 5, then the weight cut Jake has undertaken in a relatively short period might come into play and present challenges that we haven't seen in his recent matchups. That's a genuine concern when fighters drain themselves to meet certain weight thresholds, especially in a compressed timeline. However, the fact that this is an 8-round bout rather than a 10-rounder does provide a bit of a cushion for Jake in terms of stamina and pacing. If it were a longer fight, we'd be talking about much more significant red flags when it comes to Jake's ability to maintain his tempo and sharpness in the championship rounds. Jake's history with weight cuts hasn't always been smooth either. We saw that clearly in the fights against Nate Diaz and Tommy Fury. In both of those bouts, Jake looked physically taxed, particularly against Fury, where he weighed in at around 182 pounds. That's really not where Jake should be in terms of his physical health and performance. He's got a naturally broader build, especially in the shoulders, and you can see that Midwest frame in the way he carries weight. For someone like him, cutting down to that range just isn't sustainable or productive. So the fact that he seems to be walking around at closer to 220 pounds a few weeks out and targeting a final weigh-in of around 210 pounds seems much more appropriate. As long as he manages that cut smartly and methodically, there shouldn't be a huge concern over how it will affect him in later rounds. That said, weight cuts are always tricky, and how a fighter handles the rehydration and energy recovery process post-weigh-in often tells us more about their potential performance than the cut itself. Assuming Jake comes into the ring properly replenished and conditioned, then 8 rounds is manageable for him, and his team likely feels confident in that assessment. Now moving toward a more concrete prediction if we're breaking the fight down based on style, skill set, and recent progression, I would lean toward Jake Paul winning via technical knockout in the later rounds, possibly round 7. Mike Perry, no doubt, brings pressure and has an iron chin. He's fearless, aggressive, and always game, but that mindset, while admirable, only takes you so far when you start getting clipped behind the ear or caught with precision power shots. Your mental toughness means little when your balance and coordination are compromised due to a clean shot landing in the right place. Perry has shown he can absorb damage, but there's a difference between bare-knuckle brawling and traditional boxing, especially when you're in there with a younger, more athletic, and increasingly technically sound opponent like Jake's. Boxing fundamentals have come a long way since his early days, and while Perry can certainly make it a dogfight, I think Jake will ultimately find the openings he needs to capitalize on and finish the fight in the later stages once Perry begins to slow, or if the damage accumulates enough to force a stoppage. There's also an interesting evolution in Jake's development as a fighter that many people overlook when judging his path. Early on, under the training of coaches like Danny Smith and B.J. Flores, the focus was understandably narrow: develop game plans specific to opponents and win fights. Jake was extremely green at that point, so a lot of the camps were consumed by the need to survive and succeed in high-pressure situations against former MMA champions like Tyron Woodley and Anderson Silva, and in that context, the training was understandably geared toward immediate execution rather than long-term growth. However, what that meant was that certain fundamental aspects of boxing, things like advanced footwork, shot placement, feints, pacing, jab development, and defensive awareness were sometimes left on the back burner. The urgency to prepare for the opponent in front of him left limited room for technical layering and refinement. But since moving on from that phase and teaming up with his new trainers, especially in the wake of those 3 fights over the past year and a half, including the bouts against Borland and August, Jake has had the time to recalibrate and focus more on his own development, not just the game plan. That's crucial. He's not just trying to get through a fight anymore. He's actively building himself as a boxer. We're seeing progress in how he throws his punches, how he turns his hips, how he sets up his left hook, and how he manages distance. His jab, in particular, has shown notable improvement. It's becoming a real weapon, not just a rangefinder. His check hook, too, is being honed. These are not flashy changes, but they're the kind of technical improvements that separate good boxes from great ones over time, and this growth is likely to show itself against someone like Mike Perry, who, while undeniably tough, has a lot of openings in his game for a technically sharper fighter to exploit. It's also worth discussing the split with BJ Flores, which, in hindsight, may have been more critical than the departure from Danny Smith, while BJ played a significant role in Jake's early development and helped build him from a novice to a legitimate competitor capable of beating seasoned MMA veterans. His personal behavior and erratic tendencies increasingly became a liability. BJ had hundreds of amateur and professional rounds under his belt, but there's a growing belief that he may have sustained one-to-many headshots, and that's not something to joke about lightly. His social media behavior and decision-making. In recent years, posting locations, flexing luxury items in questionable environments like Colombia, where he eventually got shot, were reckless and unprofessional. These actions reflected poorly on Jake's camp, and at a certain point, a change was needed. You want people in your corner who are not just knowledgeable, but stable and focused. So, while BJ deserves credit for guiding Jake through his first few fights and laying a foundation, the decision to part ways was likely the right one for everyone involved. Looking back at specific fights, you can see where things started to plateau for Jake. The second Tyron Woodley fight, for example, didn't show the kind of technical growth one would expect from a fighter preparing to eventually compete at the world-class level. Sure, he got the knockout, but up until that moment, he looked flat and a bit unsure of himself. Then, against Silva, Jake performed well, and that was a significant win. Silva is the real deal, even in his later years. He posed real problems on the inside, and Jake managed that challenge admirably, but then came the Fury fight. That one highlighted some of the vulnerabilities Jake still has, particularly his difficulty getting inside against a longer, rangier fighter with an effective jab. Tommy Fury was able to neutralize Jake's offense and keep him at bay, which exposed some flaws in Jake's ring-cutting and pressure strategies. And that brings us to the idea of paths to victory, both for Jake and for Mike Perry. For Perry, the blueprint is simple but difficult: turn the fight into a war. Walk Jake down, crowd him, make it ugly, eat some shots, return fire, and test Jake's ability to fight in the trenches. Make Jake uncomfortable, drag him into deep water, and hope that the damage accumulates in a way that favors the more rugged and experienced brawler. Perry needs to bait Jake into abandoning his strategy and make it a phone booth fight. If he can survive the early rounds and force Jake to exchange on the inside, that increases his chances. However, Jake's best path is the opposite: maintain distance. Use the jab effectively, control range. Get in and out without lingering. If he keeps the fight at his tempo and exploits Perry's defensive lapses, he can cruise toward a late stoppage or dominant decision. It may not be the most exciting strategy, but it's the smart one. Boxing is about discipline and IQ, not just brute force. Jake has to resist the urge to brawl and stay focused on clean execution. Now, going back to Jake's fights against Borland and August, some people might argue that those bouts were meaningless or even harmful because they didn't provide the kind of resistance Jake needs to improve. There's a point to be made there, but I would push back on the idea that those fights were negative overall. Sure, Borland and August didn't offer much in the way of competition, but they gave Jake the opportunity to spend full camps focusing on his fundamentals. That kind of uninterrupted time is invaluable for growth, especially when paired with the right coaching. The question is whether Jake has developed bad habits from being in the ring with such limited opposition. Has he become too relaxed defensively? Has he gotten used to getting away with technical sloppiness because his opponents weren't capable of exploiting it? Those are fair concerns, and we'll only know the answers when he's in there with someone like Mike Perry, who's not afraid to swing back and test his chin. So, should Jake continue fighting names like Perry and Tyson instead of returning to the more traditional path of fighting journeymen and working his way up the ranks? I think it depends on what Jake wants long-term. If the goal is to become a world champion, then yes, eventually, he needs to start facing ranked opponents and legitimate contenders. But you can't argue with the fact that Jake Paul versus Mike Perry or Jake Paul versus Darren Till are simply bigger and more marketable fights. These are fights fans want to see. These are opponents who bring built-in narratives, fan bases, and media attention. Fighting another Ryan Borland won't do that. Fighting Mike Tyson even at 58 years old might make Jake one of the most talked about figures in sports. If he knocks Tyson out, regardless of age, he will immediately become the biggest heel in combat sports, maybe even in all of sports. That villain persona would elevate his profile to new heights and open doors to even bigger opportunities. At the end of the day, Jake Paul's journey is unique and doesn't have to follow anyone else's blueprint. He's fighting no names, making big money, improving technically, and building a brand that spans combat sports and entertainment. He's doing all this while fighting real fights, not exhibitions, and constantly putting himself under the spotlight. You can criticize the matchmaking or his path, but you can't deny his impact. And if he keeps improving and making the right adjustments, fights like the one against Mike Perry will be stepping stones towards something much bigger. So let's see what happens. But make no mistake, this fight will tell us a lot about where Jake Paul truly stands in the boxing world. After the fight with Mike Tyson, the most important thing for Jake Paul is not necessarily fighting the biggest names or chasing celebrity matchups, but rather stepping into the ring with an opponent that the public truly believes can defeat him. A fighter who can potentially knock him out, someone with legitimate threat and skill. Someone who doesn't necessarily have to be a massive name in the combat sports world, but who commands respect within the boxing community and who has demonstrated the ability to seriously challenge a fighter like Jake. It's crucial for Jake's credibility as a boxer to take on a real opponent at that point, not someone like Andre August or Ryan Borland, who don't bring any real intrigue or credibility and instead face someone who has the power and skill to truly strike fear into him and make the audience question the outcome. That could possibly be a rematch with Tommy Fury, which makes sense on several levels. The Tommy Fury rematch is definitely a fight that fans still talk about, and it lingers in Jake's legacy since it was his first and only loss. Alternatively, he could pursue someone like Kelvin Henderson, who, although not as big a name as Tommy Fury, is a real fighter, a former world title challenger who reportedly gave Jake serious problems in sparring and even got kicked out of Jake's camp for pushing him too hard. Kelvin also has charisma, can talk well in the build-up, and could engage in press conferences with Jake in a way that builds a genuine rivalry. Fans would believe that someone like Henderson has the tools to beat Jake, and that belief is essential to maintaining interest in Jake's boxing journey. If Jake continues to fight MMA guys after the Tyson and Perry fights, and if he wins those fights convincingly, fans will no longer believe he can lose. That mystery will be gone. Mike Perry is arguably the most dangerous MMA fighter Jake has faced to date in terms of grit and unpredictability. If Jake beats him, it only gets harder to convince people that he's at risk against other ex-MMA names. And while some people are now throwing out outrageous matchups like Deontay Wilder versus Jake Paul, especially after Wilder's recent dip in form, it's clear that a matchup like that would be absurd in terms of danger and optics. Deontay Wilder, despite his recent setbacks, is still one of the most feared punchers in heavyweight history. Putting Jake Paul, a man with a high school wrestling background and only a handful of boxing matches, in the cage or ring against a former world champion like Wilder might generate clicks and money, but would also be disastrous for the sport's image, especially if Jake somehow pulled off a win. It would reflect poorly on boxing's legitimacy if a YouTuber-turned-boxer could take down a champion like Wilder even in MMA rules via the PFL. Let's be honest, Jake's wrestling is nowhere near elite, and while he might have some success shooting for takedowns, the idea of him grounding and pounding Wilder is something hardcore fans wouldn't want to see because it taints Wilder's reputation and the prestige of boxing. It's better for someone like Wilder to enjoy his legacy and not risk that kind of loss. So if we're thinking logically about Jake's post-Tyson future, the real options are KSI, Tommy Fury, or stepping up against credible pro boxes. The KSI fight is still one of the biggest influencer boxing matchups left to make. That storyline has been brewing for years, and fans from both sides have been pushing for it. Jake versus KSI would be massive on both sides of the Atlantic and would generate a ton of buzz. Most people feel Jake would win that fight handily, so the question becomes, when do you take that fight? Do you take the low-risk, high-reward KSI fight first after Tyson when Jake is still on a high, or do you risk it all by taking on Tommy Fury right after Tyson and potentially lose again? The smarter path might be KSI first, take the win, keep the momentum going, and then go for Tommy Fury, because if Jake loses to Tommy again, the hype takes a hit, but he can rebound against KSI. But if he fights and beats XC first, then the Tommy fight becomes even bigger because he'd be on a hot streak. The danger in the Fury rematch is real because Tommy already holds a win over Jake, but many believe Jake has improved more than Tommy has since that fight, and Jake has shown more hunger and dedication to boxing. Jake's defeat clearly still bothers him, and as seen on his BS show with Sean O'Malley, it's a loss he hasn't let go of and clearly wants to avenge. Jake's improvement over the last 2 years has likely been more significant than Tommy's, especially considering Tommy's injury history and inconsistent form. That's why a Fury rematch sometime in the next year, maybe after the XC fight, could be ideal timing. Then, once those big influencer matchups are checked off, Jake can go deeper into boxing. Names like Calvin Henderson, although not mainstream stars, offer real boxing credentials and the kind of test Jake needs to prove he's not just an entertainer, but a legitimate fighter. Calvin, for example, has already sparred Jake and could serve as a natural next step if marketed correctly. You could build a story around their sparring fallout, turn it into a grudge match, and market it as Jake taking on a real world title level opponent. Maybe that fight doesn't belong on a pay-per-view, but on ADAZN or other streaming platform subscription it can still be a major event if sold right. Even fights like Darren Till, while not pure boxes, still carry some intrigue due to their name value and fan base. However, after Mike Perry and Tyson, Jake needs to gradually transition away from these MMA names and get more serious about his boxing path if he truly intends to pursue a world title. That's where names like Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. come in. He's a real boxer, a former champion with a famous name, and while his discipline and career trajectory haven't been consistent, he still presents a legitimate challenge. If Chavez fights on Jake's undercard and beats someone like Darren Till, the stage could be set for Jake to face him next. It would be a logical step up. Chavez has experience, a recognizable name, and enough flaws for Jake to exploit, plus the storyline would be compelling. Youth versus experience, discipline versus recklessness. It would test Jake's patience and skills and could be the bridge fight between fighting MMA names and fighting world title contenders. But not everyone is on board with Jake taking the traditional boxing route. Some fans, especially casual ones, prefer the name value over the boxing credibility. They enjoy the circus, the spectacle, the drama of Jake Paul knocking out a name everyone knows. Look at what happened to Nate Robinson and Tyron Woodley after they got knocked out by Jake Paul. Their careers and public perception took a nosedive. That's part of what makes Jake's fights so exciting. He's fighting opponents with reputations to protect, and when they lose, the fallout is real. That's why fans want more of that. They want Jake to continue slaying names because there's so much more drama when a recognizable name takes a loss. These types of matchups offer more storylines, more trash talk, and more mainstream attention. So there is a tension between Jake's ambitions as a serious boxer and the audience's appetite for entertaining spectacles. Still, to become a world champion, Jake has to start climbing the ladder against real boxes. That means fighting opponents who may not have the biggest names, but who have the skill and resume that boxing purists respect. It's a tough balance, appealing to casual fans while earning the respect of the hardcore ones. Eventually, though, that bridge has to be crossed. You can't talk about world titles and legacy without taking on dangerous fights against experienced boxers. People will want to see Jake tested against someone with elite experience, power, and composure he can't keep fighting guys with Flashy names but poor boxing fundamentals, the fans might still watch, but the credibility won't grow. For every Darren Till or Nate Diaz, there has to be a Calvin Henderson or Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., and if Jake beats those guys, then he might be in a position to call out a top 10 ranked boxer, maybe not Canelo yet, but someone serious. And let's not forget, KSI might not even let the fight with Jake happen unless it's on his terms, possibly demanding Jake come in drained and underweight, trying to replicate the conditions that made Jake look sluggish against Tommy Fury. That's something Jake's team should be wary of because KSI isn't trying to win a fair fight, he's trying to win any way possible. KSI knows he can outbox Jake in a fair setting, so he'll likely want to control the weight, venue, gloves, everything. And even if he shows up just to hug for 8 rounds like he did against Tommy, fans will still pay to see it because of the rivalry. But most boxing fans don't rate KSI as a boxer at all. He's seen more as a brawler who tries to survive and win on energy and awkwardness, not skill. So while Jake would likely dominate him, it still needs to happen to close that chapter. Once it does, Jake can fully focus on professional boxing. With the fame he'll have post-Tyson and post-KSI, even if he doesn't fight huge names, every fight will still get attention if the opponent has real ability and charisma. That's the blueprint. Take out KSI, get revenge on Tommy, then work your way through the boxing ranks while still choosing opponents who bring either danger or drama. Fans want to see Jake tested, not just winning. That's how he keeps the hype and builds a real legacy. If he continues on that path, the talk of a world title won't sound as crazy as it once did. The transition from influencer to real fighter will be complete not just because he fought big names, but because he earned respect the hard way. Jake Paul's career trajectory has consistently followed an unconventional yet calculated path, blending entertainment, controversy, and competitive spirit in a way that has transformed influencer boxing into a legitimate spectacle. As he continues to evolve from YouTuber to prizefighter, there's a growing recognition that the next steps in his journey must be more than just promotional events. They must be tactical moves that prove his legitimacy in combat sports. While Jake has already fought and defeated a mix of former MMA champions and celebrities, there's a consensus forming that to further solidify his standing in the boxing world, he must take on fighters with the genuine ability to defeat him, not simply people with name value, but individuals who possess the skill, experience, and reputation to knock him out. The appeal of watching Jake lose is part of the spectacle, no doubt, but to reach a new level of respect, he needs to face a boxer that strikes real fear in fans and critics alike. That opponent doesn't necessarily need a massive following, but he must be credible and respected within boxing circles, and it's time to move away from matchups like Ryan Borland or Andre August, fighters with modest records and limited promotional appeal, and move toward boxers who can headline, talk, and brawl. There's always the potential of a Tommy Fury rematch, which remains a compelling narrative. The first Jake Paul vs. Tommy Fury fight, which Jake lost via split decision, was a turning point. It's the only official blemish on Jake's record, and the way that fight unfolded left Jake visibly affected. That loss continues to weigh heavily on his mind, as seen in recent interviews and episodes of his BS podcast with Sugar Sean O'Malley. Redemption is clearly a motivating force for Jake, and revisiting that fight with a more seasoned and disciplined version of himself could flip the result and rewrite his story. If Jake can avenge that loss, it would not only clear the air on that chapter, but also reinforce his evolution as a serious boxer. But before considering that rematch, there's an argument to be made for other steps. For example, KSI has long been discussed as a logical and culturally significant matchup. KSI vs. Jake Paul would be the definitive influencer boxing bout the clash fans have anticipated for years. While KSI has demonstrated grit and marketing genius, many believe Jake has surpassed him in terms of boxing technique, power, and ring IQ. The problem is, KSI reportedly wants Jake to fight under highly disadvantageous terms, including fighting at a lower weight than Jake is used to, likely in an attempt to drain him and reduce his strength and explosiveness. If that fight does happen, and Jake accepts that challenge, it would bring closure 2 years of back and forth and allow Jake to officially close the influencer boxing chapter. Strategically, Jake might consider fighting KSI immediately after Tyson or Perry, capitalizing on the momentum, media attention, and potentially fan goodwill before moving on to Tommy Fury again. If Jake beats Mike Perry, then knocks out Mike Tyson, then defeats KSI, he'll be on a 3-fight win streak, all with huge promotional value. That would be the perfect launchpad to take on more traditional boxers with high-level experience. From there, it's time to test Jake against real threats, fighters who have trained in boxing their entire lives, fighters with regional or world title experience, and fighters with the technical edge to humble him. One name mentioned that fits that bill is Kelvin Henderson. While not a household name like Tommy Fury or Nate Diaz, Henderson is a real fighter, someone who's fought for world titles and carries himself with charisma he also has a past with Jake Paul, having trained with him and been dismissed from Jake's camp after a tough sparring session. That alone adds spice to the potential build-up. Footage from that spar, combined with Henderson's pro background, could easily be turned into a compelling narrative, especially if Henderson is willing to promote and engage in verbal warfare. During the press tour, these elements matter because Jake Paul fights aren't just about combat, they're storytelling vehicles. That's the blueprint: Tyson, then Xi, then Tommy, followed by progressively harder professional boxers who can provide both in-ring threat and promotional intrigue. Fighters like Kenzie Morrison, for instance, could be perfect for this phase. Kenzie is the son of Tommy Morrison, the charismatic, powerful heavyweight who starred in Rocky V and lived a wild, dramatic life before tragically passing. Kenzie, while not heavily marketed, carries that legacy. He has posted about Jake Paul for years and seems obsessed with earning that fight. With a pro record of 20-1, Kenzie is a legitimate threat and has the genetics and story to be a promotional goldmine. Imagine the promos footage of Tommy Morrison knocking out opponents spliced with Jake's co-highlights, with Kenzie talking about honoring his father's name. It's a fight that tells itself, and at 6'4", Kenzie presents a real physical and technical challenge for Jake, yet Jake, with his youth, discipline, and mental toughness, might have enough to overcome him, and it's not just about the Kenzie Morrisons of the world. Jake's team should be looking at names that may not be household-level famous, but come with boxing credibility and some kind of storyline. This includes fighters with famous last names, controversial histories, or those who have been chasing Jake for years on social media. These are the types of opponents who, when introduced to the mainstream via a Jake Paul fight, can elevate both themselves and Jake. It's a mutually beneficial approach. Jake gets to keep growing, and his opponents get exposure that traditional boxing has failed to provide them. All this said, there is still an appetite among fans, especially casuals, for name versus name matchups. That's what makes the Perry fight so exciting. Mike Perry is a warrior, beloved by BKFC fans, and a man who fights with pride and aggression. If Jake knocks him out, Perry's stock takes a serious hit. History tells us that once Jake slums someone, their public image is never the same. Nate Robinson never recovered from the memes. Tyron Woodley's MMA legacy became the butt of jokes. Anderson Silva fought valiantly, but losing to Jake Paul undeniably tarnished how fans remember his final fighting chapter. If Perry gets knocked out, there's no doubt his status in BKFC would take a dent. That's why this fight is high stakes, not just for Jake, but for Perry too. And that's the kind of fight people pay to see, a duel where reputations hang in the balance, where both men have something to lose. From a broader perspective, the most effective route forward for Jake might be to alternate between big-name matchups and legitimate boxing tests. Maybe fight a Chavez Jr. type, or a seasoned former champion with a recognizable surname, then pivot to a younger, hungrier, lesser-known threat. Keep the fans guessing, maintain suspense if Jake ever wants to make a run at a world title land. It sounds like he must build a credible resume. Not every fight has to be a headliner, but each opponent should be carefully selected for the right blend of skill, marketability, and story. Beyond the matchmaking, One thing that could improve Jake's long-term image is letting go of some of the criticism toward his former team. While it's understandable that he wanted to move on after the Fury loss, publicly dragging former coaches like BJ Flores and Danny Smith isn't always a good look. These are the same guys who helped him knock out Woodley and outbox Anderson. Silva, Danny in particular, even advised Jake against taking the Tommy Fury fight when he did. That deserves acknowledgement. Jake's new team might be improving his technical output, but respecting the contributions of those who helped build the foundation is an important step for any athlete transitioning from controversy to legacy. Looking even further ahead, Jake's path could culminate in a situation where he either goes for a legitimate regional title or takes on a major step up like a cruiserweight contender or former champion. By then, his draw would be so powerful that networks and promoters couldn't ignore it. Pay-per-views, documentaries, behind-the-scenes YouTube series, it would all converge to create a spectacle unlike anything else in modern boxing. And in this sport, spectacle matters. You need eyes, you need narrative. And Jake Paul, whether people love him or hate him, knows how to deliver both. In summary, the ideal progression looks like this: win against Mike Perry, then defeat Mike Tyson in what would be a historic win, regardless of Tyson's age. Follow that with a long-awaited showdown against KSI, closing that influencer boxing chapter once and for all. Then rematch Tommy Fury and go for redemption. After that, begin the process of defeating increasingly credible professional boxing fighters like Kenzie Morrison or Kelvin Henderson before eventually taking a shot at a title or facing a truly elite boxer. That's the journey that will transform Jake Paul from viral fighter to respected pugilist, and through it all, the intrigue will remain because Jake brings something boxing desperately needs: fresh eyes, fresh narratives, and fresh energy.